risk. Risk is our business. That's what the Starship is all about. That's why we're aboard her.
Engage.
There are 3 things to remember about being a starship captain. Keep your shirt tucked in, go down with the ship, and never abandon a member of your crew.
I don't care if the odds are against us. If we're going to lose, then we're going to go down fighting.
But we're going to learn from those mistakes. That's what being human is all about.
What a piece of work is man. It is a tale told by an idiot.
Make it so.
Hello, Internet. Welcome to the Boldly Going podcast, a podcast where 3 guys in their early 20s talk about every episode of Star Trek ever made. I'm your host, Alec Tim.
I'm Bailey Sider. Hey, and I'm Ethan.
And today we'll be talking about the pilot for the original Star Trek, Where No Man Has Gone Before. This episode originally aired on September 22nd, 1966, if you can believe that. It was written by Samuel A. Peoples. It was directed by James Goldstone. This was the second episode of TOS ever produced, though it was technically the 3rd episode aired. We'll get into that a little bit as the series, as we go on with our discussion later on. But I thought that it was appropriate to watch the episodes in the order that they are shot, because particularly here, there's a lot of kind of weirdness that will not carry over to other episodes. If you're not 100% familiar with the plot synopsis for Where No Man Has Gone Before, this is the episode where Kirk's friend Gary Mitchell gets hit with a force field while they go through the edge of the galaxy. And Gary Mitchell and Dr. Elizabeth Denner basically become super god, human-powered beings. Kirk punches one of them. I won't spoil which one it is. And Spock yells a lot in this episode, which is a little bit odd. So, what are our initial thoughts before we really get started on in-depth discussion about Where No Man Has Gone Before? What are your kind of initial thoughts on this episode?
It was interesting. It was a ride, I will say that.
It was a ride.
I'd say that there's a lot of hokey going on in this episode. There's a lot of ideas that I have serious doubts will be picked up later, because some of it does border on the verge of what sci-fi is even about. But I will say that there's at least a kernel of true sci-fi at the base of it. It is fundamentally dealing with encounter with the unknown, and regardless of how well we can discuss that manifests, sci-fi is about that idea, encountering something unknown and seeing how that plays with humanity outside of what it's outside of the usual. So that's good sci-fi. But yeah, there's a little bit of crazy going on here too.
So it's a little bit hokey. It was the best of the 3 scripts that were pitched for the second pilot. Because if you're not entirely familiar with the history of Star Trek, there is a pilot episode that was shot for this called The Cage. It starred Captain Christopher Pike and Gene Roddenberry's mistress turned wife, Michelle Barrett, as number 1. The only carryover character from that episode is Leonard Nimoy's Spock. Paramount, when they got the script, when they got the episode, they liked the idea, but they didn't really like anything about The Cage. And The Cage was the most expensive pilot ever shot at the time. It cost $600,000. And yet, remarkably, they decided to do another one. The gentleman who played Pike, who I can't remember his name off the top of my head, didn't want to come back, which we look back now and think, boy, can you imagine being the guy who said, no, I don't want to do Star Trek?
But then we wouldn't have got Kirk.
We wouldn't have got
current iteration.
So while The Cage is considered canon, and it is part of the Star Trek story, there's a later episode in Season 1, the only 2-parter of the original series, called The Menagerie, that uses a lot of clips from The Cage as sort of a clip show. And I think that if you don't watch The Cage, it actually makes The Menagerie a pretty decent episode. So they're coming together. They've got 3 scripts that they've put together. This one, The Omega Glory, that was written by Gene Roddenberry himself, and Mud's Women. All 3 of these episodes end up getting made, though it took until the 3rd season for Gene to force The Omega Glory through, because the Omega Glory sucks. I'm going to bury the lead a little bit there and say the Omega Glory sucks, and I'm really glad that was not the pilot episode of Star Trek. I actually like Mutt's women, which is a little bit of a controversial opinion. We'll get there when we get there. I know not everybody is as signed on to Harry Mutt as I am, but I actually liked that episode. But the studio execs didn't like the idea of their Star Trek space adventure show starting off with an intergalactic pimp. They thought that might have been a little bit vulgar and inappropriate, so instead they went with Where No Man Has Gone Before, which, in my opinion, I don't want to get ahead too much before we do ratings, but I think it's a pretty good episode. It's got a lot of weird problems, and it's got a lot of weird idioms, but I think overall it's pretty good. Now, do you know who was in the screening when this was shown to massive success? It did really well. There's a very famous story about a famous sci-fi author who you might have heard of named Isaac Asimov, who was at the original showing of this episode and was really, really excited about it. And he kept talking before the episode started, and Gene Roddenberry shushed him. He shushed the man to be quiet, but he didn't know it was Asimov himself. And when Roddenberry found out afterwards that he had shushed Isaac Asimov, the father of modern science fiction, he was deathly embarrassed.
I don't know. Stand proud, man. You got to stand up for your principles.
Well, and Asimov was a huge fan of Star Trek until the day he died, and he and Gene actually had a great working relationship. I wish Isaac Asimov had been heavily involved in the first 2 seasons of TNG, but we'll get there when we get there. So, right out of the gate, this episode kind of starts a little bit of a kooky concept.
Yeah, we start with 4D chess.
4D chess. This is the first time we see 4D chess. And this is going to be one of the carryover themes in every Star Trek show going forward. What do you think about the 4D chess? That famous Star Trek thing that's in literally every Star Trek show.
Well, the first time I came across it was in, sadly, The Big Bang Theory.
Get out.
Oh, goodness. So, definitely had a bias going into that. Yeah, 4D chess has been a meme across the internet for, I don't know, a very, very long time. But it's neat to see its origins here. It's fun to see Kirk and Spock going at it, establishing parts of their relationship. Certainly interesting to see Kirk reference Spock having some bad blood, which is like some subtle space racism off the bat. Good times, thank you, Kirk. But it does introduce at least that there's something about Spock that should be letting you know that he's not the same as whatever his species is, that he's somehow different from what you should expect from the rest.
If you're a fan of the original series as well, this scene is kind of a weird barometer scene for you, because Kirk is pretty much perfect. I'm going to tell you right now, they basically nail Kirk's character right out of the gate. Spock is the character who is the most off in this episode. And by the next episode, Spock is going to be kind of the Spock we know and love by the time Corbomite maneuver comes around. And I'm not just talking about his makeup. His eyebrows are way entire.
Touching his bangs. Well, there's a reason. It's because his disapproval is expressed primarily through his eyebrows. At least that's how I could tell when he wasn't yelling in this one. It was all eyebrows. Just
Spock yells a lot in this episode.
I didn't notice that,
he yells for no reason. Spock will not be yelling again. Spock yells a lot. And at first you think it's just stuff like, he says, "Ensign, do this thing," which is kind of like one of those old Navy hang-ups that they think they're going to carry over. But then other times, he's just yelling because. And his makeup is even less toned down than it was in the Cage. When the Cage launched, the censors didn't like how they said that guy looked like Satan. So they toned Spock's makeup down. They're going to tone him down even more. Spock in this scene does this weird thing where he smiles. And he goes, "Oh, yes, I wrote the line down." He says, "One of your Earth emotions, irritation," which is such a not Spock thing to say. That's like a Data line. Like, one of your Earth emotions is something that Data would say, than what Spock would say. That's kind of weird.
Yeah. Also, can we talk about how Spock looks very similar to the Spock we will know later, and yet the rest of the crew looks so young? Like, I mean, Leonard Nimoy aging phenomenally, but sweet heavens, did you see Scotty?
Scotty's like a little baby.
Yeah. He is a sweet little bab in this one.
But hey, show some respect. That man's a World War II veteran.
Indeed. Maybe one thing we can do before we go on is there's a very different crew at this point.
Yes.
And sort of they're throwing out references to who's in what position at any given time. So one of the things I looked at as we were even establishing some of the basics was, like, who's in what position on the ship at this starting point.
There's one thing I'll jump into that before. There's one other thing I want to touch upon Spock. If you're a canon purist like me and you're paying attention, Spock references one of his ancestors as having married a human, which is, my wife is watching with me and she goes, yeah, your mom? Because for those of you who know Spock, you know that he is half Vulcan and half human. It's not an ancestor, it's his mom. Also, Spock is never mentioned as a Vulcan in this episode. They just say, my father's people. But you're talking about the crew. So right out of the gate, there are two characters who are notably missing from this episode. Lieutenant Uhura is not in this episode. And Dr. McCoy is not in this episode. What did you think of Dr. Piper? Did you even remember his name?
I didn't even know he was a person in this show. And I have a feeling that he will be disappearing from this show in the not too near future.
Yeah, while I was watching, as I was jotting down notes, every once in a while I didn't know who I was referencing, and so at one point I was just like, yeah, the doctor guy. Didn't know his name.
Chief Medical Officer Dr. Piper. Dr. Piper gets canned by episode 3. So if you think about how long it took for TNG to get kind of the ball rolling with their crew complements, by literally the next episode, Piper's gone, he's replaced with McCoy, and Uhura is there.
Okay, so does he at least have the decency to get shot?
No. Dr. Piper just vanishes. He's never referenced ever again. I was
really funny.
I was on Memory Alpha reading, to see, because there are hundreds of Star Trek novels. Like, if there's ever been a minor character on TNG, there's 8 books about them. There's some great books about Shelby as a throwaway. But there's nothing about Dr. Piper. Nobody cares about Dr. Piper.
He retired.
That poor guy wanted to stay on, but Gene wanted DeForest Kelly from the beginning. Yeah. Because they'd worked together on one of his cop shows.
Okay, so new canon, Dr. Piper gets space malaria and something like that, okay? We'll give him a dignity of having a way out, and that's why we need Bones.
So, Kirk is captain. He's wearing terrible turtleneck uniform. I actually love the original series uniforms. I think they're nice. I think they're kind of sleek. They're my second favorite uniforms in the whole franchise. I don't care if anybody makes fun of me for that. But these uniforms suck. Can we talk about the giant zippers?
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah, I even noticed that being it my first time.
Yeah, one of my other genres is JRPGs, so zippers don't really bother me. In fact, I find that they tend to be a staple of character design. So,
do turtlenecks bother you?
No. What have turtlenecks ever done to you, Alec?
They look terrible on Star Trek,
but also very loose turtlenecks.
And not everyone knows where the zipper is going to go. Kirk's on his shoulder. Dr. Denner, who's a guest star in this episode, hers is all the way up her back, which to me, when we consider kind of like Gary hitting on her on the bridge, it's I don't think you'd want your woman's clothing to be so easily undone in the 60s when it's a little bit of that space sexism is rampant there.
Yeah, but Kirk might.
So Kirk's uniform is a terrible tan turtleneck.
Mustard yellow almost.
Spock is wearing a terrible tan turtleneck as well. By Corbomite maneuver, that uniform will be blue.
Hey, but Spock's uniform matches the skin, so.
Spock's terrible turtleneck. Scotty is wearing a brown turtleneck, because nobody's wearing red in this episode.
Yeah, they aren't wearing their official positional uniforms, like the colors assigned to their function.
Yeah, because the three branches, science, command, and services, there's no red in this one, which it's amazing how much adding that third color and getting rid of that stupid tan really makes a difference. Sulu is here for one scene, and he's the head of... I looked it up. In this scene, he's the head of astrophysics. He's a mathematician.
Yep. And suitably, his line is about numbers. So there you go.
Sulu does math. This never comes up ever again. I like Sulu a lot, so trust me, Sulu never does math ever again. He's a lot of things. He's a fencer, he's a botanist, he's a pilot. He's a well-developed character, but he never touches math ever again. Now, you could say that Sulu gets promoted to helmsman after Lee, the helmsman in this episode, gets strangled by a cord in one of the scenes that I don't know if it's funny or kind of sad. It was working really well until they had Gary's face half faked over it, but we're jumping way ahead of ourselves here. So maybe it's Sulu gets bumped to helmsman after Lee dies, but Sulu is clearly a science officer in this episode, so it doesn't make any dang sense why Sulu would be jumped into helmsman. But by, again, Corbomite maneuver, Sulu was helmsman. So we got that established. We're missing 2 of our characters. We've got people in strange uniforms. The bridge set is pretty much perfect. The bridge set looks great. There's one thing that they're going to cut, and can you guess what stupid thing is on the bridge set that is going to be gone within like 2 or 3 episodes?
Is it the female ensign that always stands behind Kirk?
Yes, but I was thinking of Kirk's stupid microphone. You know, the super sleek command chair, that great set, and there's this giant freaking microphone when he does his captain's log. He leans into it.
I thought it was a desk lamp.
I thought it was a desk lamp. That's what Jazzy, my wife, said. She's like, "Why's Kirk need a lamp?" No, the female ensign. I wrote this down. Yeoman Smith. She has one line in this entire episode, which is when Kirk calls her the wrong name. He calls her Ensign. I can't remember what he calls her, but her name is Yeoman Smith. If I told you right now that when they pitched this show to the executives and there were 2 characters on the cover of the package, one of them was Kirk, could you guess who the other character was?
You're not telling me it's inside.
It's Yeoman Smith is the other character on the package that they sent, and it was literally because of sex appeal. I'm not even kidding. She isn't even in any other episode. She's only in this episode. Smith and Piper are gone.
Does she get the dignity of getting shot?
No.
Oh.
But hilarious behind the scenes story when it comes to her, this was not a part that was in the original script. She was supposed to be an extra. Now, according to Herbert F. Solo, who was studio executive for Desilu Productions, so he was one of the big wigs at the time they were making this, and he was heavily involved in the first 2 seasons. He said that Gene Roddenberry thought that Andrea Drom, the actress who plays Yeoman Smith, was attractive. That's why he cast her as Smith. Here's a direct quote from Solo. Quote, "Actually, it was a non-part, but during the casting process, director Jimmy Goldstone overheard Gene say, quote, 'I'm hiring her because I want to score with her,' end quote. It was not only a non-part, I'm pretty sure it was a non-score as well."
Yikes.
Even the great bird struck out on that one. Andrea, this does lead, though, into a great story about Shatner and why he worked out so well. Because she talked about how she had other stuff lined up because she wasn't sure if this was going to work out. And Shatner was all in on this project. Because she talked about how, you know, when they sign you for a pilot, you don't know if you're going to have a job. You don't know if it's going to get picked up. And so she wound up leaving the show to be in the film The Russians Are Coming, which I've never heard of. Drom, you could have been in Star Trek. You know, you could have been in Star Trek and done more than hold Gary Mitchell's hand and stand behind Kirk. You could have been Janice, giving Kirk his papers. Yeoman Rand, who will be showing up in a few later episodes, is kind of what Smith was supposed to be, but her hairdo is much crazier and more sci-fi.
So speaking of the people who are just in this episode, we do have Lieutenant Kelso that you mentioned. He was the navigator.
He
correct?
died too soon.
Yes. Gary Mitchell,
Who's
our
terrible.
Gary,
We'll get to
from
that.
a certain point of view, and Elizabeth Denner, the psychiatrist. Very qualified, I'm sure.
Very qualified.
In fact, here's a quote to show how qualified she is. "In tests I've taken, my ESP has rated rather high." Which is an interesting segue into the whole ESP concept.
Yeah.
Because they talk about it as if it is something that is like an established scientific reality among humanity, and that it has some sort of general use within Starfleet, even if at its lowest levels, and people are tested for it regularly, and da-da-da. And it's, of course, important for this episode, but is that a concept that we will see later developed?
Yes and no, and here's what I mean. Humans are no longer psychic for the rest of Star Trek. This never ever comes up ever again. However, Vulcans are psychic. So by the logic of this episode, Spock should have gotten the godlike powers, because for the rest of Star Trek, Spock will be telepathic, and he's the one who's got, you know, some psychic
But then
ability.
it would have worked with like the theme.
Yeah, so wait, are we saying then that Dr. Denner and Sir Mitchell here are technically the greatest psychics to ever have come out of the human race?
Technically, yes.
We lost them too soon.
And when we see that slideshow where Kirk is looking through the scanned versions of the medical records on his little Windows slideshow, we can see that they have crazy high psychic scores. One other thing, speaking of Denner and Smith, before we go further into the episode, to point out is that they are wearing pants in this episode. The female crew members for the rest of the show will be wearing like the mini dresses with the short skirts that just go below their butts. I was a little bit distracted by the fact that they were wearing pants because that dress look is so iconic for classic Star Trek. I can't believe Gene Roddenberry let pants get on that set. I'm very disappointed in him.
I greatly appreciate pants. Me and them get along very well, so I'm going to miss them.
You're going to miss them. The men get to keep their pants. It's kind of like in TNG after season 3 when they switched the uniforms from a jumpsuit to a two-piece. Unless you were the ladies, and the ladies had to keep the one-piece. It's super noticeable in Best of Both Worlds Part 1 when Shelby is in the elevator with Riker. But that's neither here nor there.
I'm sure we'll have some discussion about that when we get there.
So, the sets are already pretty good. The theme song is already pretty good. It's not the best, but it's not the worst. They're about on point. Sets are good. Costumes aren't great.
The opening is spectacular. I don't think it'd be an underestimation to say that this is one of the most classic and well-respected science fiction openings.
I've been watching the remastered editions on DVD, and they look gorgeous. If you're listening and you have the opportunity to watch the remastered versions, they do a great job. They don't George Lucas it, where they throw a bunch of extra crap on the screen that wasn't there. They do take the original effects shots and they redo them, but they redo them in the style and the theme.
With respect.
With respect. The planets, in particular, in the remastered version, look gorgeous.
I mean, you always have to acknowledge the limitations of special effects from the era you're in, but just hearing Space, the final frontier, and hearing that whole dialogue proceed, it's great. You know you're back in a good era.
But can we talk about that? Patrick Stewart knocks that out of the park for TNG. Shatner does a good job, but Patrick Stewart kills it. He puts such gravitas into it. So we're introduced to Kirk and Gary. Gary is one of his Starfleet Academy friends in the Earth service. They don't say Starfleet yet.
Correct, and you'll notice that he wasn't a friend as a student. He was taking Kirk's class. They weren't classmates. He references taking Kirk's class.
And I will say that this is the kind of story that could only work in a pilot. Yeah. Because if this was a later episode, when Kirk says, "This is my longtime friend Gary," we'd say, "Who the heck is Gary? We've never seen him." But this is the pilot, so this literally works because we this is the first time we're meeting Kirk and Spock. So he says, "This has been my longtime friend Gary Mitchell," and I believe him. I believe Shatner, who's a great actor in this, but we'll get onto that later.
I don't believe anyone can be friends with Mitchell for a long enough period of time.
No, Mitchell is both a terrible actor and a terrible person. He's on the bridge trying to do his job as a helmsman, and Dr. Denner walks on, who is, she's an attractive lady, but Mitchell immediately makes a pass at her. Immediately makes a pass at her. She's a psychiatrist. She's there for her thing.
Professional.
And she shuts him down, and he calls her a walking freezer unit. Which is just, immediately. Do your job, Gary!
Now, here's the question. Has he not made a pass on her before this point?
I don't know. I get the impression that Denner is not a regular part of the Enterprise crew.
Where'd she come from?
I don't know. It's not super clear. I feel like she's a specialist that they bring on for this particular mission.
Didn't it say she came from a planet or something?
Okay, that's fair. She probably brought on for her tests and ESP on which she rated rather high. I'm sorry, that's going to show up again.
So this episode is kicked off. The events are kicked off by the destruction of the starship USS Valiant.
Yes.
You don't see, which it went beyond an energy barrier at the edge of the galaxy, survived the trip, and the captain self-destructed it. Nobody knows why.
For some reason. Yeah.
Now, the concept of the edge of the galaxy isn't really going to work for future Star Treks where they make the galaxy much bigger. I'm going to be 100% honest with you guys. I really like that idea.
I was just going to say that it is a great concept. It really emphasizes that there are parts of space that are unknown, which establishes very well the purpose of the ship and being an exploration vessel and saying there's still mystery in this universe.
Yeah. You'll feel that a lot in this series, especially if you grew up in a TNG fan where Starfleet was always close. In the original series, the Enterprise really feels like it's alone. I don't think you see another Starfleet vessel the entire first season.
That's cool.
And it is cool. It's got a great vibe to it. So they approach the energy barrier, and Spock pulls out this stupid earpiece that looks like an old-timey rotary telephone, which is another prop that I hate. They're going to have a little earpiece for the rest of the show that looks great. Kind of retro sci-fi aesthetic. Yeah. But Spock's got his giant rotary telephone earpiece, and he's shouting, "Put up the shields! Put them up!" He's shouting! Spock yells a lot.
Well, it should tell you that what's happening is urgent.
They go through the barrier.
Urgencies. Those human emotions.
Gary holds Yeoman Smith's hand the entire time. Gary's trying to use his console one-handed because Smith's holding his hand. This is a life or death situation. He should have both hands on the wheel, but Smith's standing there holding his hand. That's all she does in this episode.
Silent otherwise.
They promised in the package where they were introducing all the characters to the executives that Smith would get coffee and be easy on the eyes. That's literally her character description, and she doesn't even get coffee in this episode. Oh, the 60s.
Goodness gracious.
And they go through, a bunch of stuff blows up in classic kind of Star Trek-y fashion. We see the first time where they do the spark shower, which I love, and I don't care.
Yeah. Although, can you say Caesars? Because there is no flash warrant for this episode.
No.
Let me tell you, special effects consist of rough practical effects and a lot of flashing lights.
The lights look pretty decent in the remastered version, but they're still flashing. My wife pointed out a pretty crazy plot hole, though, that I never quite thought of. Why didn't Smith get zapped when she was holding Gary's hand and he got zapped?
Because she doesn't have high ESP.
There
Do not pay attention.
So Gary gets knocked out, and Denner just has a bit of a headache because her ESP is
Although,
not as strong.
if you're going to say they're knocked out, we got to go to that moment, like, right before he actually passes out. And they have, like, there's some compositional shots that I have a lot of questions about in this first episode. Because as soon as that light show stops, you see Gary staring off into space, and it holds that frame on his shocked face for, like, 5 seconds.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be this, like, really weighty moment. But all I could think of is either, like, shocked Pikachu face or dramatic groundhog. And I was just like, I'm sorry. I know what you're trying to, like, get me to feel, but it's not working.
It's
Hand from his face.
because
Go.
Gary sucks as an actor.
And then he catches himself as he falls to the floor.
Smith doesn't help him, by the way. She's just there to be helpful, and he falls over. She just lets him fall.
And she still doesn't say anything.
And she doesn't get coffee.
She doesn't get, no, because her only line is, "My name is Smith, sir." Anyway, the pink force field knocks him out.
Yeah.
I do think it looks great. Spock goes and flies the ship when Gary passes out. It's a little detail. I don't think Spock ever takes the con ever again. That's not something I'm 100% clear on.
Because he's not good enough to use it one-handed.
Yeah, I mean, Gary could be out there, like, holding hands with pretty girls and running the con one-handed. If your game isn't that Chad, I don't know what you're doing on the USS Enterprise. And then there's this crazy thing that Spock says in passing where 9 crewmen have died.
Oh, don't worry. We're going to get to death count at the end.
Death count for this episode is crazy high. But that's right out of the gate. Another difference, if you're familiar with TNG, is that characters don't die a lot on TNG.
Yeah.
But on Star Trek is famous for red shirts being killed off. But in this episode, right out of the gate, we're only like 15 minutes into this episode. 9 dead. Boom.
And they're not red shirts because we don't have those yet.
Exactly. We don't even have red shirts. There's this interesting thing where their warp drive is knocked out, kind of classic Star Trek. And this is another line that really sells that idea of where they're alone. I really love that. Because even on TNG at Impulse, you could probably get somewhere. And Kirk says, journey that would have taken us a couple days is now literally out of reach for the Enterprise if we don't get our warp engines back online. Which puts a lot of nice tension into it. I really like that. He calls it space warp instead of just warp. There's a few little things like that. Scotty calls the transporter the Energizer. But again, they're remarkably close.
It's world building. It takes time to get down to the brass tacks of like what you actually want your world to represent and have in it. So I mean that's understandable at the start of the series.
Yeah, it says it's going to take them about 70 years to get to any inhabited planets at Impulse, other than this one nearby abandoned, relatively obscure planet that's just there for lithium mining. Again, lithium, not dilithium.
Fully automated.
Fully automated, yeah. And this is where the meat of the episode kicks off. And we can tell this because Gary Mitchell has got these terrible contact lenses. I want to stress that I do like this episode. I know it sounds like I'm being critical and I'll have a lot of good stuff to say later, but I hate those contact lenses.
Speaking of props in general, I mean, the contact lenses are one thing. That medical bay is probably not a great example of what you can do with practical effects. And even on the side of sound design, I'm not sure if you noticed, but all the doors opening have the standard trademarked sci-fi door effect. Like, whoosh.
See, I always associated that sound with Star Trek. So maybe it's like they were there for...
Either they established it or they're using it. Like, that's not a knock. It's just you're going to hear some familiar sounds.
Also, Gary doesn't help the sell of the contacts.
Yeah, Denner is better with... Like, Denner is not a great actress, but she's better than Gary.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see Gary he's resting, he's kind of recuperating, And he's talking about like these strange abilities. He's starting to read really, really fast. That's the first sign. He's clicking through the slideshow really, really quickly. And he's talking to Kirk a little bit. He talks about how Kirk's a bookworm. Kirk was a bookworm in Starfleet Academy, which I love right out of the gate. Watch Star Trek, J.J. Abrams. Kirk was a nerd in high school.
I was confused there because I thought that he mentioned that he was a strict teacher.
I feel like maybe I should have watched this episode like two or three times. I got the impression that Kirk was also a student, but
so like a TA kind of deal.
Because this is Kirk's first command. He makes that clear later in the episode. This is his first command. And according to like Memory Elf or some of the other sources, Kirk, I believe, is like 35, 36. He's relatively young for a captain, but he's had other experiences, but this is his first command. There's this great little moment where Gary says to Kirk that he wishes that because Denner is going to look after him because she's a psychologist. She wants to see how he's being affected. And Denner doesn't think very highly of Mitchell. Yeah. And Mitchell would like to get into her space pants, but she's too busy being a freezer unit to let creepy Gary into her space pants. And he gives a line to Kirk like, I wish you'd given me an easier nurse. And Kirk says, consider it a challenge. I wrote that down. Kirk says, consider it a challenge. Which should be the creepiest line ever. But Shatner is so darn charismatic and likable that he just delivers this with such charm. This was the first scene I really noticed how bad Mitchell is. Because Shatner is really good. Shatner is really good in these early scenes. He gets a little hammy, but I think he pulls through it. And in this scene in particular, he really gives off this easy kind of 60s buddy act, and Gary is kind of stiff compared to Shatner. Yeah. Which does work in his favor when he becomes less human, because then at the end, he says, I was serious, and he starts getting all threatening and weird. Yeah. Which causes Kirk to leave. You
need to treat me right.
You need to treat me right. And he does well in those scenes. I think he can pull off kind of menacing. Yeah. So maybe it's kind of like a Hayden Christian deal where when he doesn't, because there's a scene coming up that I think he really sells, actually. I was talking to Bailey about this before the podcast started. That is really creepy and effective. Yeah. Now, you're probably thinking of it. Are you thinking of this scene that I think that is creepy and effective? Spock and Kirk are watching him on the camera from the bridge, and he looks right at the camera, and he knows that scene is very creepy and it's very well done.
Here's a question about ESP in general, because ESP at the beginning of the episode is presented as somewhat of a knowledge / empathic kind of thing. Yeah. Where they're sort of at best a limited telepathy, knowledge, and sort of emotional understanding of people. Do you feel like the episode was consistent in portraying this as an enhancement of human ESP, or do you feel like they sort of started bending the rules a little bit? Because he starts like interfacing with a tape cassette at one point, and a few other things.
He's got telekinetic powers.
We'll list the powers by the end. I have a full list of like 12 different things that he does. But it seems like, do you feel like they're being direct in like enhancing ESP, or do you feel like this is new?
Well, for me, since I went in blind, I have so little experience with any of the stuff, right? I just started getting confused as he continued to deviate little by little as his powers enveloped him, I guess. And it just got, by the end of it, I was just like, well, what is it?
I feel like they treat ESP like just psychic power. Because, I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know if ESP in real life is bunk or not, but they definitely kind of treat ESP as like telekinetic superpower. They're going to kind of play with this concept of human evolution later in Star Trek. There's an episode of Voyager that does a terrible job where Tom Paris turns into a lizard. But you know what we're talking about. But for me, I think I agree that the powers where they come from doesn't quite work, but I think what it leads to is so good that I don't really care. Because even in these early scenes, you see Gary start to care less and less. There's the scene where he fills the cup, which my wife is watching. She goes, why do they have an unprotected spout in the medical bay wall without a sink underneath it? The spout never comes back.
I told you, the set design for the medical bay is probably the weakest on the ship right now.
Probably.
And here's the second question sort of connected to the first bit is, when you look at the ESP as well, do you see that there is malign intent behind it. There's some moments in the episode where it seems to just be power, and the power's corrupting the individual. Sometimes he seems to discuss it as, this is no longer Mitchell, this is something else.
Spock, right out of the gate, believes that Mitchell is no longer Mitchell.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea, I know that there are Star Trek episodes that will deal with body snatchers, more or less, in various eras. But in this one, do you feel like they do a good job of talking about the power corrupts absolutely angle, or do you feel like it's being treated almost as if an entity is being dealt with here?
Well, yeah, it kind of looked like Gary was being possessed more than him gaining these powers, especially when they end up going down to the planet and he hits that force field or whatever, and then the power drains, and then he comes to a little bit, and then it kind of shows his personality, and then it's gone.
I can see that, but to me, I really bought the idea that it was his own kind of person. Because the episode is, in that one scene, like, we joke about how Gary is, like, kind of a douche, and how he's, like, trying to pick up ladies while he's on the bridge, and how he talks to Kirk. He's like, hey, man, you wouldn't have been anything in Starfleet Academy without me. So they, in a little bit of time, the script does a decent job of selling us the idea that Gary isn't that good a person.
That's true.
Right out of the gate. And I think the episode does a good job of selling the idea that, Gary no longer has anything in common with humanity any more than we have in common with insects. I think that's a literal line from the episode. It's kind of like the idea of how they do vampirism in Warhammer, where when you transform into a vampire in Warhammer, and it was a total tangent, but your personality doesn't immediately change, but the idea is that you are now faster, stronger, smarter, better. In every conceivable way, you start to become detached from humanity, and I think that is presented well in this.
I think the score goes well with it.
Yes.
Well, because it's in the beginning when he first gets in contact with his powers. The score is very like subtle, but then as it develops and as he grows in power, it just becomes a lot more present and more malicious, I guess.
I really noticed the score in this episode.
Yeah.
It's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I would fall very much on Alec's side when it comes to the ESP being more of a force that is simply Mitchell enhanced, and that's the corrupting influence. I like when sci-fi has a little bit of ambiguity, though, because it does make you question, like, what is the difference between a human detached from his moral principles and someone being possessed? Like, that is fundamental. Like, that's a question that underlies it all. Is like, is Mitchell still in there? Well, yes and no. Is sort of the answer that I get from this episode. So there's fun that can be had with science fiction when you allow it to give you that space to think about things, even while it does have like a concrete answer. As long as it presents itself ambiguously enough, you can go down some really neat paths.
So after that sequence, Kirk and Spock, Kirk joins a Spock. Spock tells him that Mitchell is growing exponentially. He talks about how his powers are increasing rapidly, and soon they won't be able to deal with anything. Kirk is struggling because they're good friends. We have this really creepy scene where Mitchell looks right at the camera while Kirk and Spock are spying on him in sickbay, and I think that's a really effective scene. It legitimately gave me like a little chill. Then we have one of the more awkward scenes when Denner visits Mitchell in sickbay. It starts poorly because I don't normally notice direction and camera work, and I think that's typically a good sign. But there's this extreme close-up where the camera's a little tilted down and you're looking right up Gary Mitchell's nostrils. And I don't know what James Goldstone was thinking when he organized that shot, but I'm sure you noticed that the camera's looking right up Gary's nostrils for one of the shots. It's very distracting.
Well, they're really trying to emphasize how empty his eyes are, but they're not quite talented with their close-up shots in this particular episode.
I feel like if this episode had been made now, it would have been much closer, and it might have worked. Denner comes in. She and Gary's kind of a creep, and he really hits on her, and gets a little grabby.
What else is new?
With her.
He's a special character. Man, Mitchell.
I think Gary is important because people think Kirk is what Gary is. Yeah. Like Kirk is never grabby. Kirk is never handsy. Like, Kirk has his fair share of interactions with women throughout the franchise.
Oh, that's what we call them. Okay.
But Kirk is never kind of rapey like Gary is. There's no way around it. But anyway, they're trying to sell us this idea that Denner is, like, vaguely interested in him when she's way out of his league.
Which should be a warning sign. to be honest. That
That's
something is happening.
with Denner, which they haven't established yet, but that's a good hint.
Yeah.
Anyway, it looks like they're going to kiss, and then Lee comes in and blocks Gary. Lee is Buddy, who works in the other panel.
Now, to be fair, this isn't why Mitchell kills him later, but
I like to think
fair
it
enough
is.
reason.
Poor Lee. He comes in, he drops a couple lines. Gary's kind of mean to him. I don't really remember the details of that scene, other than I wrote in my notes that Gary is blocked by Lee. Then we have a great conference room scene where we have the first of many conference room scenes that will become famous in Star Trek. TNG loved the conference room scene. I love a conference room scene. Sulu does math in this scene, very basic, where he says, it's like doing with a penny. You double a penny every day,
In 2 months,
you'll be a millionaire. Which, it's amusing that we don't even have pennies now, but pennies are coming back for the future.
I'm excited.
I'm excited for that. But I really wrote down, Kirk is really on point in this scene. He gives a great speech.
We also have pragmatic Spock in this scene.
Spock is great. Actually, this is Spock's best scene when he says, we got two options. We can maroon Gary or we can kill him.
Yeah.
Which is a brilliant scene to remind us that Spock is a cold, logical person.
Yeah, but I liked how it didn't hold any like malintent and went away from who he really is. You know?
Oh, he's very much just evaluating
Just
the
detached,
realities
yeah.
and presenting the two valid options from his perspective.
Yeah.
And that's I think what the core of Spock is and should be in the series.
Kirk gives a great speech about how we have to be careful. Denner jumps in and defends Gary, but gets shot down pretty quickly about how he is dangerous, because he is by this point.
Yeah.
He's starting to show real malevolence. Kirk gives this great speech about how important it is for compassion, though he emphasizes that later, and I really wrote that down because I really like his ending speech for this, which, again, right out of the gate, you're introduced to the idea that Kirk is a bit of a philosopher himself. Picard is famous for the speeches, but right out of the gate, they're establishing that Kirk is a man of deep thought and principle as well, and I really appreciated Shatner in this scene. Do you guys have any other thoughts about that conference room
actually,
scene?
It made me think about like just the theme of the episode that I kind of got from it just from my first time. It gets like very philosophical, the theme, right? It goes into like this kind of two-track theory where you're going down a train track. Who do you save? The one person that you're emotionally attached to, or save the bunch of people?
Trolley problem.
Yeah, and it kind of it pits against emotion against logic there, and I think that then that is represented in and embodied in Spock and Elizabeth.
And when you are going, then that's going to be a huge theme of the entire show.
Yeah.
Where McCoy, who is not in this episode, but will be showing up in the next episode, not the episode since, McCoy is that character.
Yeah.
McCoy is the one who is always pushing for emotion and always trying to help. And Spock is the one who's always pushing for logic. And they really play... These three characters are brilliantly well developed. They play well together.
Yeah.
And unlike Denner, who we're starting to see at this point, is good foreshadow that she's got some on her own, that she's like, this isn't just about Gary. It's about her as well. It works out well.
Yeah.
Then the nearby lithium cracking station that's totally automated, that they can get enough power packs to fix their warp drive and get out, is named...
Delta Vega.
Delta Vega is the name of the planet, but more importantly from that, when Kirk speaks to Gary in the next scene, he tells Mitchell that he's been worried about him ever since that night on Deneb 4. Now, the planet that the TNG pilot episode takes place on is Deneb 4. I don't know if they did that on purpose as a callback, but it's a really nice coincidence. I'd like to believe they did that on purpose, because that's way too specific a reference. But there you go. There's a connection between the two pilots. They both have a reference to Deneb 4. But Delta Vega is where they're going to leave Mitchell. Mitchell is supposed to be a great god. He zaps Kirk a little bit, and then Kirk punches him right in the face and knocks him out. And Piper tranquilizes him.
Good job, Piper.
Piper does one of two things he's going to do in the whole episode. And they beam him down to the planet, which, by the way, I love the set for the lithium cracking plant on Delta
it's really
Vega.
cool.
I think it's great.
Yeah. It was pretty good. It was a good set. One of the things I want to mention is the conversation right before they tranquilize him and bring him down. has a lot of setup that sort of echoes characters like Ego the Living Planet or a few others in other things where it's like, this is the world I could use, or growing stronger, or you're like insects in comparisons. Like, you really see him stepping into that godhood personality. But there's also this idea of grand intent, of it's not just I'm a god, but it's I can be even more than that, given the right setting and a place where I can make my own.
And he's really going to drive that home when he brings Elizabeth over to the dark side when they're down on the planet and sells her this idea that you don't even need them. I wrote in my notes, Kirk punched that god when he knocks him out, which is such a Kirk thing to do. I like the Delta Vega set a lot, so I was saying. I like the matte painting. I'm a sucker for a good matte painting. I think it's a great matte
I noticed
painting.
that. It was really well done.
I know by today's standards it's kind of an old-timey set, but by Star Trek standards I legitimately think it's one of the best sets that they do. The background is reused from the Cage pilot, and since nobody ever saw the Cage until DVD sales, waste not, want not. Kirk has this really weird line in that scene where Denner says, I guess we're all alone down here, and Kirk says, nobody but us chickens.
Kirk goes back and forth on some very weird things. Like, he's got that line. And then I think, like, the scene before, he's talking about, well, what's going to happen if these things don't succeed? And he's just like, radio into Central Command and have neutron radiation in place. And you're like, wow, Captain's got to do it. Captain's got to do it. And then he's jumped.
Kirk is on point. He understands that he puts the safety of the ship before his own friend. He's decided at this point that it's better to take care of the people before them. We have this brilliant scene where Scotty beams Spock down with a phaser rifle. I love the phaser rifle. I think the prop looks awesome.
Yeah.
I love the concept of the phaser rifle. Too bad it never comes back.
Are you serious?
I did the math. I did the math. We do not see the phaser rifle again until The Next Generation. Season 6, episode 26. There's 149 episodes between this use of the phaser rifle and the next time we see a phaser rifle.
To be fair, we only saw it effective on rocks in this episode.
Yes.
We'll get to that. I love the phaser rifle.
I actually really liked it, just because it kind of reminded me of like older Doctor Who episodes and their like technology. It was just
The Dalek beam?
Yeah, exactly.
Good times.
Yeah.
So Denner requests to stay alone with Mitchell because Kirk wants a two-man watch, one in person, one over the camera. And everyone's like, fine, you can just stay, which is probably the only real weak point in the plot. Kirk's already decided they're going to maroon Gary. Gary kind of knocks himself out on the force field.
Comes through a little bit.
Says, you should have killed me when you had the chance, James. Which Kirk is like, he's not going to do it. He's not a murderer. Denner has been kind of close to Mitchell, but he still leaves her with there anyway. And Gary spills her this whole speech about how she's going to be like him, how they don't need anybody else, how they're going to be gods. Spock's like, better kill him. And Gary's reading Spock's mind, knocks Spock and Kirk out. Denner's eyes turn all silvery. And
Which, if you were paying attention earlier in the episode, she said, in tests I've taken, my ESP has rated rather high, so you should have seen this coming.
Yeah.
She was the only other person affected by the zap. So the two of them run off in the desert. Dr. Piper does the only other thing he does in this episode, and he wakes Spock and Kirk up. But before that, he's brought the terrible news that Lee has been strangled to death.
Yes, by the way, I actually liked that scene.
Where Lee gets strangled to death, and
Yes.
Gary's face is half
Not
exposed.
the face. Not the face. It's,
That ruined
I
the
actually
shot.
really liked how they used the practical effects to move the cable and bring that up. And like the whole setup of the scene was actually pretty decent for something of its
It was
production.
pretty intense.
For its time.
For 1966, watching a guy get strangled with a cable on live TV would have been pretty intense.
But it actually looked very serious. Like, it looked threatening.
And you didn't see any cables or, like, you didn't see the wire. I think that really works. Gary strangles Lee because Lee's the one who has to bomb the planet.
Yep.
So Lee ain't going to be bombing the planet no
it's
more.
because he blocked him. Let's be honest.
He was going to pick up Denner, and Lee walked in and blocked him. That's why he got it. So he had to get strangled with a cable.
Yep.
Kirk goes off alone, and Kirk has one last interaction with Spock. This is earlier. I wrote this down because I love this sequence where right before Denner turns evil, Kirk and Spock and Denner are talking about what to do with Mitchell. And Spock says, we need to kill him. He's a dangerous threat. Denner says, no, he's not. Kirk turns to Spock and he says, Spock, what makes you more qualified than a highly competent psychologist to ascertain his mental state. And Spock says, simple, she feels, I do not. And that line is so boss.
Yeah.
That is so Chad. The way he delivers it is so baller that I got goosebumps.
Yeah.
Where he's like looking at this objectively. He's like, I know what needs to be done.
And that's when he knew he had to stop yelling.
I love that
That's
line.
awesome.
I wrote down that I loved Spock.
Yeah.
I've always loved Spock. And this was at the point where, because I've seen every episode multiple times at this point, I knew we were getting close to the end. And I got to take a brief aside to point out how well paced this episode is.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
Some of the Star Trek episodes in the original series drag, particularly because these are 50-minute episodes instead of 45. This is not one of them. The episode is paced extremely well.
Yeah, one of my notes was that it was like really riveting.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole way through.
Except for the power escalation, which puts Dragon Ball Z to shame. Let me tell you how many powers that are possessed by Mitchell at this exact moment.
Before the final showdown.
Yes. He has emotional detection, limited telepathy, telekinesis, electrokinesis, high-spec, remote viewing, accelerated power growth, agrokinesis, presence detection, energy resistance, reality manipulation, and creation ex nihilo. So the only thing he's missing is teleportation, which will be his fatal flaw.
And he doesn't have immunity to rocks.
To be fair, I do like this concept of someone receiving power and struggling with it, and that I just feel like they went really off the rails and they just went full bore with it, and so it made it harder to stomach the finale because I didn't really buy him getting crushed by a rock. I'm sorry, I didn't. After seeing him just creating this garden out of nothing, which by the way we're digging into Judeo-Christian mythology here.
For a guy who really didn't like religion at all, Gene Roddenberry was an avowed atheist. He was really quick to pull from that well.
Yeah, we're gonna jump into this sort of empty, chaotic state. We're gonna pump in a garden, and then we're gonna see man who wants to make themselves gods. I mean, there's nothing here that's really setting off any bells. But and Kirk talking about above all else, a god needs compassion.
Well, we'll get to that because that is my favorite speech though of the episode.
Yeah, okay, then we'll save that for that time. But I think that the whole concept of jumping straight to godhood from this ESP made it almost wasted the potential of it, because there's almost two concepts you're dealing with here, of someone who is gifted beyond their fellow men, which is almost a discrete category of its own, and then someone who truly has power in the godhood realm. And so I think by jumping super fast through it and accelerating through, they almost missed two stories in a way of like ideas to develop.
They do this really well at TNG. There's an episode in the first season, which I know the first season of TNG is kind of mixed, but the episode where Q gives Riker the powers of the Q, I think is a version of this that I think is really well done, where they play around with that story. I think this story does a good job with it as well. I like the idea of like suddenly, now that you are basically a divine being, how your own human weaknesses, your own human failing. Like Kirk drives that point home. It's like he's got the powers of the god, but the flaws of a man. Mm-hmm. And that really sells it. And then Kirk goes off by his own. And this is something that's very Kirk. It's very different than what Picard would do. Kirk puts the safety of the ship and his crew ahead of his own life. He's the one who's going to go down, and he's going to take care of business himself. Just hit one man in his phaser rifle, which looks great.
I respect it. Good job, Kirk.
It's a great Kirk moment, and Kirk's a lot like that. He's going to go down and punch this god and take care of business himself so that the Enterprise is safe. Kirk bumps into Denner, who Denner is a little more human still, because her ESP isn't quite as high.
She's like Mitchell earlier on in the episode. She's
still reachable.
Phase. Yeah.
And Kirk gives this brilliant speech about how, above all else, a god needs compassion. I love that speech. I think it's real strong for Kirk, really getting his philosophy on, really touching on why it's wrong for a person to have this kind of divine ability. Mitchell shows up in response to that by saying morals are for men, not for gods, which is a great rebuttal to that. But there's a detail that I really like about this episode is that Kirk shoots right away. As soon as Gary shows up, Kirk fires. Yeah. He doesn't hesitate. He's made up his mind. He's like, this guy is my friend, but I have to kill him. And he doesn't hesitate. Fires right away. It's useless because Gary's superhuman now.
And it also only works on rock.
He shoots him and he absorbs it. But there's a lot of tension in that. I think the effect doesn't, because Bailey and I were talking about this, and we're about to get into this. Yeah. I think the effect works fine. I think it's a really tense moment. Kirk rolls and fires. Very fluid. It's a great scene.
Yep.
and Gary throws Kirk around with his telekinetic powers.
Yeah.
Gary reaches out. The scene is really tense. It's really well done for a show from the 60s. I'm really into it.
Yeah.
Kirk says, Denner, you have to fight him. And we have the worst sequence that really kills the tension.
I was going to see if you guys were going to defend this, because let me tell you, it looked like Emperor Palpatine took some muscle relaxants, and then they just let him go.
That sequence sucks. It almost sucks more than the fact that Kirk's initial is wrong in that tombstone. I'm sure that all the big Trekkies out there have noticed that when Gary raises a tombstone for Kirk, it says James R. Kirk on it. All you Star Trek fans know that Kirk's name is James T. Kirk.
Yeah.
I actually noticed that too, and I was a little bit confused. And then I was like, oh, I guess I was
They were
just
figuring
wrong.
it out as they went
Yeah.
along.
Yeah, can we go back to the part where they look like dead fish getting electrocuted?
That's after the tombstone. I just really had, I had to touch on that.
Blank face.
I've heard all sorts of people out there. There's some people who argue that this means this episode is in an alternate timeline where Kirk's name is R. Kirk.
Oh.
I would like to point out that this is just because they're figuring the show out and everything is new. Roddenberry, afterwards, he said, if you want to look for a canon reason for it, it's the fact that Gary, even with all his power, made a mistake. Because he's still a human. Which is
like
like
that.
good in hindsight, Gene. But it's a funny little thing. It's a tidbit that everyone will notice. Now we're on to the part where they look like dead fish, and the acting is terrible, and the effects are terrible.
Oh, it was bad. Yeah, me and Bailey have watched classic Doctor Who, and this is up there with some of the best bad effects.
Ooh. Yes. Flashing lights.
I honestly think they might have been better to just do it
Mentally.
as a mental contest of wills between the two,
Yeah.
because it
almost the
ended
same.
up being like that, but then they just added lights, and I'm like, you didn't need that.
And that scene really shows how bad both those actors are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I was saying, Dinner's better than Gary. It's like, no, she's not.
Nope.
Hers was worse.
Hers was worse.
Yeah,
Hers was worse.
It was. I will say that. She slowly fell over as she lowers herself to the ground, but not falling over.
But they also had...
Then she's just lying
Yeah.
there with her arm up above the ground.
They simultaneously, though, had to add the special effects, because unless they went into it with the intent of having it be without lights, what they got, if they didn't add the special effects, it would have been twice as bad. So it's like, you either have to double down on saying, we're not doing special effects,
It would have
and
been
film
really
it in that
awkward.
way,
Yeah.
or you got to go with what you
Because
got.
they could have
And,
just
that's-
kind of squinted at each other like that one episode of TNG that absolutely stinks because the telepathic aliens look like they're pooping the whole time. But it would have been better than...
Yes, it would have been better.
Because, like I said, I thought the tension was built really well. The episode was really well paced. And this really pulls me out of it.
Yeah, it really tanks the whole tension.
Fortunately, though, after that, when Gary's powers are stripped, we get the scene that literally sold NBC the episode.
You mean when Kirk starts doing a fist fight with
Yes.
the depowered god?
I'm not
Because
kidding.
Kirk is... I wrote down,
I love
this
Kirk
seems
fist
to be the
fights.
first moment when we get into the classic trademark Kirk fist fight.
NBC decided to make Star Trek a weekly television series because of this episode. Gene Roddenberry said that they liked the cage, but unlike the cage, there was a fist fight, a bare-knuckle fist fight, and that's what sold NBC on Star Trek. This fight between Kirk and Spock, where Kirk does the trademark double axe handle to the back of Gary's head, is the scene that sold the network executives on Star Trek.
I can see that.
I think it's a pretty decent fight scene.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah,
Kirk rips his shirt.
it could use.
I
a
was
little
just
bit
about
more,
to say we're gonna get-
choreography, but
That's my...
I still think it's really good.
I have
it's good for
two
the-
counts. I know I'm going to have to add a third. One of the counts that we're going to go over at the end of, I hope at the end of each episode, ruined Kirk shirts,
Yes.
because that's going to be a good one. Death count,
Yeah, we have to do that.
and Kirk's women.
Yes. So we're basically at the end of the episode. Kirk rips his shirt. He knocks Gary into the grave that Gary had made for him. The rocks get shot with a phaser rifle. The rocks fall on Gary, and he dies.
Don't believe it. Not for a minute.
And then Elizabeth just dies because.
Because she lost the the will. She got a broken heart. She got a broken heart.
Oh my god. Kirk beams him back up to the ship. He has one last scene with Spock where he talks about how he wants the records to stand and say they died doing their duty. And then they head back to the nearest starbase with their jury-rigged engines for some last-minute repairs. So this episode holds an original series record for death count. There is a total of 12 fatalities, which is the most of any episode, though not the most on screen. There are some episodes later where we'll see more characters killed on screen. This includes Mitchell and Denner in the death count.
Yes, we have 9 crew members killed in the storm. Lieutenant Kelso, Mitchell, and Denner. That's
So
our
12 kills. Kirk rips his shirt once. Kirk does not get it on with the lady in this episode. Before we go to our final ratings, what are your general kind of thoughts? Like just bullet point summarize. We're almost done here. What are your kind of thoughts overall on the episode? Bailey, why don't you kick this
It was
off?
a great start. It was a great start for me going in blind. I found it riveting, and it just hooked me on this first season.
Ethan?
Sci-fi is about humanity expanding its boundaries and encountering the unknown. So basically, every episode I evaluate is going to somehow come back to how well it handles that premise. And while I think this was hokey, it does it pretty well. Things that I'd take away, some of the quotes I loved. Above all else, that God needs compassion. Great quote. And humanity is defined by its frailties, even in the midst of power. So I do like those ideas. And overall, yeah, decent episode.
Now, for me as well, there obviously, like as a longtime fan, there are a few little things that like bug me. I think about those stupid turtlenecks. I miss Uhura and McCoy. But I think overall, you can see that they've got a strong show on their hands. I think, again, especially compared to Encounter at Fairpoint, I think it's pretty clear that their show is about to find its footing. And I guarantee you by next week's episode, Corbin might maneuver, that they'll basically be on track for the rest of the show. They get it within 2 episodes. And overall, I think it's a fairly solid episode. So just for kicks, we're going to rate the episode on an A through F scale. Pluses and minuses do apply. And just as a general overview, again, all opinions expressed on this podcast are our personal opinions. Gene Roddenberry thought this was one of his top 10 episodes of the entire show. I don't share that sentiment with him. I do like it. And so if to you this is a top 10 episode, leave a comment and let us know why you think that so I can tell you how wrong you are. Ethan, if you had to grade this episode on an A to F scale with minuses and pluses included, what would you give this episode?
For being a pilot especially, I'd give this a solid B+.
B+.
I don't think it breaks into A territory, but I think that it's pretty much as good as you could expect from the beginning of a show like this.
Ethan gives it a B+.
Given that I haven't seen the rest of this season at all, I don't want to give it too low or too high of a rating in general. But just based off of what we were talking about and how well it was written and put together and just all the craft involved, I would say a solid B+ as well.
That's pretty creepy that you guys are both identical on that. I am very close. I'm going to give it a solid B. For me, it was almost B+, but as a long-term fan of the series, I miss Dr. McCoy too much. I really hate the turtleneck. And for me, it was going to be a B+, but literally the Zap fight between Denner and Gary dropped it an entire half point.
See, I give it irony points for that. That was so classic bad Doctor Who that I needed to give it some bonus for that.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for a reason to explain the discrepancy today, that's probably it.
For me, same. This is a solid episode. It's not exceptional.
Absolutely.
It's not mind-blowing, but for a pilot, it's great.
Yeah.
It's great how well Kirk and Scotty in particular, how they're already on point. I think it's a solid episode. If you're doing a watch-through of the series, do not skip this one. Start with this one. Don't watch it third in the airing order like the network executives did, who said this episode was too expository to be a good pilot. So instead, we're going to air an action episode as a pilot instead of the pilot as the pilot. Watch this episode first, so that way you're not like, where's McCoy? Why is there a turtleneck? Why has Kirk got a desk lamp? So that'll be all of this for the Boldly Going podcast. Join us next week where we join Corbin Might Maneuver. And I'm going to play my hand a week early and say I think Corbin Might Maneuver is a top 10 episode for the entire show right out of the gate. So from all of us here at Boldly Going, bye everyone. We'll see you next week.
Throw out your turtlenecks.